Good afternoon, everybody. We are getting started here on part one of the agreement of sale training. Generally, I do this in two portions because as real estate professionals, we are limited to 90 minutes of attention span, and this usually takes a little bit more than 2 hours to cover. So we're going to work through the first half of it until everybody kind of zones out, and then we'll get into the second half um, next time around. Okay? Any specific questions before we get started on stuff? All right, well, please, let's make this as interactive as possible. Um, don't hesitate to speak out, ask questions, make complaints, or share personal experiences about certain clauses in the contract. It's super important as we're going through the agreement of sale. I learned this early on to learn how to paraphrase effectively. And the best way to paraphrase effectively when we're doing the agreement of sale, explaining it to a client, is to tell a story about certain sections. So that's one of the ways that I teach the agreement of sale is to tell a story or an experience that relates to a certain clause in the agreement to help drive that point home, not just with you, but with clients so that they understand what that legal language might mean. Anybody else have that experience? I said interactive.
Yes, I parrot you frequently when I go through the agreement of sale.
Great.
Yep, it's always
Okay.
good.
All right. Can everybody see my dot loop here?
Yep.
Yes.
Excellent. Thank you. I'm also going to take you to my favorite resource. That's parealtors.org. parealtors.org. You're going to want to go to member login. This is your one-stop shop. Kyle, I know you don't like paying the dues, but you got to admit, this is a pretty good resource.
I don't have to admit that.
Oh, all right. Well, for me as a broker, it's a great place to go. It gives me what I need to make sure that I'm explaining things or understanding things. So I go here, I can go up to this little search. Go to the search window, and then you can scroll down through here. You can put in things like standard forms. You can even type in standard agreement of sale. And then it's going to give you different options. And in this example, there's actually 3 resources in one. You can download the marked up version. What's the marked up version? You may have noticed that we got a new agreement of sale in August of 2024. That marked up version shows the differences between the one that we were pretty accustomed to and then some of the new changes. We can download the current version here, or we can view the guidelines and download the guidelines for preparation and use. If you've been around here at all, you'll recognize how much I lean on and preach the value of the guidelines for preparation and use. Everything we have in the library of standard forms has guidelines for preparation and use. I've already downloaded them here and I have them in my dot loop. And you'll see we have the standard agreement for the sale of real estate guidelines for preparation and use updated on August 2024. How many pages do we have to that? 55 pages? No, 66 pages for a 14-page document. That tells you everything you need to know. All of these capital, all caps, are references to a boldface heading in the agreement of sale. So if you are cruising along in your agreement of sale, it's about midnight, you're trying to get this thing in before the clock strikes on a deadline, and you have a question, you can look here You can call me, you can look here and then call me for confirmation, probably not at midnight. I'll get back to you in the morning. But if you have a dying question and you're at a specific paragraph, you can go to the guidelines and it's gonna match up exactly and tell you what you need to know. One thing I like about the agreement of sale, it's not just a technical manual. It also gives you some general notes on usage. There's going to be different practice tips throughout the guidelines to keep you on the straight and narrow, not just with the agreement of sale, but with the common law of the land when it comes to contract law. So, such as, do not use such terms as all registered owners or owners in title. It's going to tell you specifically everything that you need to know to make sure your contract is valid and enforceable. Okay? Okay. What do you, has anyone used the consumer guide to the agreement of sale? I think this is a great resource. This has not been updated since 2022. So there's some slight variances. However, it's written more generally than the guidelines for preparation and use. And the consumer guide is going to be geared towards the layman, towards the consumer of real estate, and it's going to inform them. This is more important now than it ever has been. Before dot loop, before SkySlope, DocuSign, Zip Form, True Form, whatever you're using to get your contract in front of your client, we used to meet with people in person. And anybody who's been doing this business long enough can probably explain a contract reading it upside down. And you'd go down through the agreement, hitting on every paragraph, explaining things as you went. And it was probably a 2-hour process to get them to go through the buyer's agency contract, the consumer notice, and everything that you didn't do, all in one fell swoop from beginning to end of this contract. And you would go through everything. Now, what's it take to send a contract off to somebody to sign? About 5 minutes, and it's back in your inbox signed. This, if you send it out to them in advance, is going to guarantee, or at least guarantee the opportunity for them to investigate in advance, to read through this and ask questions. So whenever you're sending somebody your buyer agency agreement and your consumer notice, which we absolutely have to do in advance now that it's the law of the land, why don't you send this with them to get it in front of them? It has a lot of good information in here to guide them through the process and to manage expectations, to make sure that there's one more opportunity for them to understand what they're signing. 90% out of the time, 90% of the time, when we have a situation between an agent and their buyer client, what are they going to say?
They didn't tell me that.
You didn't tell me that. You didn't explain it that way. That's not what I didn't know what I was signing. And uh in the client's defense, there's a whole lot of stuff and it's moving pretty fast at this point. And we have the benefit of doing this 5, 10, 20 times a year. Maybe we've done this 5, 10, 20 times before we got to this client. So we're a little bit more polished and we're moving at our own pace. We're speaking with industry jargon that we understand and the client may not. You're dropping stuff on them like VA, USDA, home inspection, EMD. It's all moving very fast and they may not understand everything. But by putting this consumer guide in front of them and asking them to sign and attest that they have read it and don't have any questions, it's one more chance for you to do one of the most important things in your job, which is limit your liability. Anybody a boxing fan? You ever watch a boxing match? First thing they do is they bring both combatants to the center of the ring and they say that you have to protect yourself at all times. And I want you guys to get into that mindset. It's warfare out there and you need to protect yourself at all times. And it's never a problem until it's a problem, right? We've done it this way 99 times in a row. It's the 100th time that something's going to back up on you and cost you money, sleepless nights, or a loss of reputation. We don't want you to have to go through that. So do yourself a favor, try and protect yourself and your client and the brokerage, and put these documents in front of your client in advance so they can get a good look at it. Okay, enough of that. Let's go to the agreement of sale itself. I'm going to use the red line version because it's a nice one to teach off of. Any objections to using the marked up version that we got last year? Thank you for not objecting. Is this too big for everyone to see? I know we can't see it all on the screen at one time, but my eyes are shot. Okay. According to the agreement of sale, according to PAR, we're supposed to be using all caps when we put in our buyers and sellers. Does anybody do that? Raise your hand. Me neither. I'm guilty of that. Is it important? I'm sure to somebody it is, and there's probably a reason to do it. But to be perfectly honest, I haven't seen any negative repercussions of not using all capitals when identifying the buyer or seller in the agreement of sale. It's something I've tried to do more. When we get to identifying the property, it's very important that we fill this out as completely as possible. As I explain it to my clients, this is a cover sheet that is going to follow this transaction through its life. It's going to go from here to our transaction coordinator or to our admin. It's going to be the beginning of the transaction. It's going to go to your lender. It's going to go to your title company. It's going to go to the bank's appraiser who's going out to value the property. So it's very important that we have all the information here to identify it. One of the things that can sometimes derail us in a transaction, I know that I've spoken with a couple of you on this meeting already, where we've had this very same situation where there was multiple properties in the transaction, right? One address, couple different tax IDs. There's a front lot and a back lot, a right lot and a left lot, and they both might be identified as 123 West Main Street, but sometimes the tax ID or the parcel ID for both lots doesn't get on there. Can somebody tell me what happens when both tax IDs or both parcel IDs don't make it onto the agreement of sale? I'm not going to move on until somebody talks.
You only purchase one parcel.
That's right. And then what happens comes springtime? The seller gets a tax bill.
Eh,
And then the seller calls the broker and says, what happened? And it can go one of two ways. Oh, I'm so sorry. Let me get on the phone with the title company and we'll get that squared away. Or the seller says, that's my property. Tell me one good reason why I should convey it to you. In either case, there's a potential for exposure here because taxes were prorated on just one lot. So now we have to figure out who's responsible for that tax bill that wasn't necessarily included in the transaction. And that can sometimes mean buyer has to pay it. It can mean that the seller's paying some of it. Maybe they split the difference. At any rate, it's something that would be better handled at the time of the contract. So be aware, if you're listing a property, make sure with multiple lots, make sure both lots IDs or all three or all seven, make it into the MLS, make sure that note is on there. And then whenever you get a contract in front of you, I know I'm so happy to get a contract that I sometimes get excited and forget to check all the details. I'm sure you're the same, but try and pull it in and check the details and make sure that all those tax IDs are included in there. Okie dokie. Now, let's talk about the buyer's relationship with a PA licensed broker. It's good to have this completed completely. If you ever need a company license, they're hanging on the wall in your respective office. If you're not in the office, call your admin or me, and I will text you a picture of the license so that you can include that. If you're representing the buyer or seller, it's good to have that. Especially if you are in the Iron Valley of Central PA office, be aware there are more than one Iron Valley of Central PA offices, and we only own and operate the Carlisle version. The ones in Linglestown, Hershey, and Camp Hill belong to our corporate friends. So those are separate. You will always be checking skip that. You're going to be checking either buyer agent or dual agent. Typically, what are the situations where you might check dual agent? Anybody?
If
If
you're
you're
in the same office, Oh, go ahead.
if you're in the same office.
If you are in the same office or you're in another Titan 4 office, I'm going to ask you, because over disclosure never really got anyone in trouble. I'm going to ask you to fill out that dual agency. So if I'm the broker, please check dual agent. Did I screw up the size of the share page? You can't see the whole sheet, can you? Now you can. So dual agent, if Justin's the broker, check dual agent.
Justin,
Now,
and
go
that's
ahead.
just any Iron Valley that you are the broker of, right? Just want
Yep.
to make sure I heard that. Okay, thanks.
Yep. And if you have a question, shoot me a text.
Okay, thank you.
Yep. Now, we are a designated agency shop. That is a decision that your broker makes about whether we are buyer agent or buyer agent with designated agency. Anybody want to give us a crash course on that agency relationship and what the difference is? This is kind of an old school thing. In the old days, a lot of brokerages would function that all agents were specifically an extension of the broker, right? So, I mean, you are an extension of the broker, but they kind of felt that all clients belong to the broker. Think of it that way. So that if I was writing an offer, Kristen was representing that client and April was representing that client and Susan was representing that client. But as the business has evolved, it's gone kind of a different direction. And we believe that those clients are more likely to identify with their agent specifically, right? Where April represents her client to the exclusion of all other agents. so that that client belongs to April, and I have designated April to be that designated agent. Susan does not represent that client. So we are a designated agent shop. And that is why Susan can represent a seller and Kristen can represent a buyer. And that is not dual agency as far as the agent is concerned. It is dual agency as far as the broker is concerned. So every time you fill this out, unless you are representing both clients, please check buyer agent with designated agency. The vast majority of brokerages that you work with and practice with on the day-to-day practice that same philosophy that they are designated agents. Okay? Same thing on the seller side. This is a great time that we can talk about the agency relationship in general. I want to look you in the face when I say this. So, this has changed a little bit with the way that commission structures have shifted, right? I have always been opposed to dual agency for dual agency's sake, right? I believe that our relationships with our clients are built off of trust and pre-existing relationships and a track record, right? We all feel kind of a bond with them. I urge people to have a relationship-based transaction rather than, a transactional experience. And I think that that leads to more repeat business and smoother deals. However, we put a sign in the yard on a listing, somebody calls us up, what's our first reflex? Dual agency, right? I'm going to sign them to a buyer agency and get this property under contract. I think it's important to go back to our relationship with our seller, which is based on trust, and we have a pre-existing relationship with that seller, right? A buyer who calls us off the sign, we may have never met. We don't know them. We don't know how crazy they are. We don't know how many agents they've been through. We don't know exactly what's going on. So in those cases, I consider them a customer, not a client. They have walked into my real estate store and said, I'll take that one. In any other retail business in the world, we know who we work for. We work for the guy who owns the store. And in this case, we work for the seller who owns that house. The buyer who walks in is a customer. They're not a client. The exception to that is, I'm listing my friend Bob's house. My friend, Charlie, he's been shopping for a house and I've been showing him a house when I get around to listing my friend Bob's house. And I say, hey, Bob, I think I'd like to show this to Charlie. I say, hey, Charlie, I think you'd like Bob's house. I have a pre-existing relationship with both of them. That is a true dual agency situation because you have a pre-existing trusting relationship with both of them. You're going to be a little bit more capable of managing that because it's a relationship. It's not just a stranger who called you off the street to see a property. There's no level of trust there, and you're able to manage that a little bit better. So I encourage you to try and represent one party at a time unless you know both of them. If you're ever in a question whether this is dual agency or you're going to be representing or taking care of a buyer customer as a transaction licensee, you find yourself in that situation, you start to get the sense that you're going to be in that situation, please give me a call. I'll walk you through it and make sure that you're protected. Why do I not like dual agency? because I like to protect my agents and my clients. And it's much easier when we only represent parties that we know and have a good relationship with and that we have a good dialogue with. But if I'm representing a client that we have a long relationship with and some person that we just met off the street and something goes sideways, I have to be very careful to walk a fine line to represent them both equally. Um, it's much easier to fight one side of it because I can play devil's advocate pretty well. I can fight on both sides of it. The only thing I can't fight is myself. And if we get to mediation or something like that, I have to have a very hands-off attitude. And by helping them both, I actually help neither of them. So if you ever have questions on that, I just want this to raise a flag in your head. I better call Justin. Give me a call. I'd rather talk to you in advance of that situation than when we're knee deep in it. So some of the changes that they made to all the other contracts in 2024 were very useful because they carried through with some continuity the information that's reflected in the agreement of sale, like state licenses, et cetera. So I thought that that was one of the good things to come out of the contract changes in 24. So this is the dual agency thing I was just talking about. A broker is a dual agent when a broker represents both buyer and seller in the same transaction. A licensee is a dual agent when a licensee represents buyer and seller in the same transaction. All of the broker's licensees are also dual agents unless there are separate designated agents for buyer and seller, and that's why we're designated agents. This is the date that you write the agreement, and as I explained to clients, when we write this offer or when we fill this contract out as a buyer, it's an offer. When it's signed by the seller, it becomes a contract. And more than a contract, it's a roadmap to the transaction. You're going to find that this 14-page document is full of if-then statements that don't mean a whole lot to you now, but they're going to be very useful if things go off the rail. And it's how we get this transaction back on track or how we handle it if it's irretrievable. So if I don't dive deep into those if-then statements, it's because they don't mean anything to you now, but I'm going to paraphrase things for you. That's how I explain this. Purchase price and deposits, pretty straightforward. It's in US dollars to be paid by the buyer as follows. Can you pay in Bitcoin? Sure you could. We just need to find a title company to figure that out. Has anyone done anything fancy with numbers 1, 2, and 3, all these different deposits? They're often not used, but PAR is very good at giving you the flexibility to practice this, how you want. I've seen it where there's an initial deposit upon acceptance. It didn't used to be 5 days. It used to be, with acceptance of this offer, a deposit was necessary. And then additional deposits might come following due diligence. So if you have a 10-day due diligence period, 5 days for negotiation and 2 for cancellation, a seller might request an additional 1,000 or 5,000 or 10,000 to be payable once you get past the inspections to make sure that things aren't going to fall apart on the home stretch. I've seen that. And then additional deposits, maybe if it's a extra long escrow period, something like that. I always joke that if you want something to be ignored, make it bold print or all caps. And this is one of those that everyone seems to look past, but it's a condition of the standard PAR contract that all funds paid by the buyer, including deposits, are going to be paid by check, cashier's check, or wired funds. And all funds paid by the buyer within 30 days of settlement, including funds paid at settlement, will be by a cashier's check or wired funds, but not by personal check. Very specific on that. Cashier's check and wired funds are what they call collected funds. Those funds are good when received, unlike a personal check. Personal check's not verified. Why is this so important and why do they have 30 days on there? This has been on there since even before this whole tidal wave of fraud kind of crashed over us. This has been on there because if a check is bad and deposited into a broker's account or a title company or a settlement lawyer's account, I'm going to carry that check down to Members First and deposit it. And they're probably going to deposit that money in my account today or tomorrow, and it'll show up as funds. They might not find out that those funds are no good, meaning there isn't any money in the account, until that check gets back to PNC next week, if it's in Harrisburg, or SunTrust Bank in Virginia in 2 weeks. And by that time, when it's presented back to the issuing institution, if those funds are not good or not present, they will actually pull those funds out of my account. And if that's a $10,000 check and I've got, two $4,500 commissions outstanding on that account, now checks start bouncing to agents and it's a whole thing. So that's why they like to have this 30-day on here to make sure that everything's good. So not so much an Iron Valley policy, more of a PAR policy that everybody's pretty much overlooked since the beginning of time. We encourage you not to overlook that. Deposits, regardless of the form of payment, will be paid in US dollars to the broker for seller unless otherwise stated here. It's very important that we note who is holding that money if it's not the broker for the seller, so that we know where to look for that check. When you've got, 40 or 50 transactions pending at a time in a given office, it's easy to kind of lose track of these things. Who else might hold that earnest money deposit?
The title company.
Title company. And what should we be aware of if the title company is holding it? Well, let's look to the agreement. Whoever is holding it will retain the deposits, it says on line 17, in an escrow account in conformity with all applicable laws and regulations until consummation or termination of this agreement. Goes on to say that only real estate brokers are required to hold deposits in accordance with the rules and regulations of the State Real Estate Commission. Checks tendered as deposit monies may be held uncashed pending the execution of this agreement. So it says only real estate brokers are required to hold deposits in accordance with the rules and regulations of the State Real Estate Commission. What are those rules? There are very significant rules, and those rules are that money may only be released upon mutual agreement or unappealable court order. So if the deal fails and that money is held by a title company, that check may be released quite possibly to the first person to get on the phone with the title company and say, hey, that check's coming back to me. And are they entitled to it? Maybe, maybe not. But if there's not a mutual agreement, then the agents involved could be in a bit of trouble if the other party takes issue with how that money was distributed. So if you're having a title company hold that, I recommend a third-party escrow agreement. There is a PAR form for that. And if you get into a situation where somebody insists that a title company hold it, please give me a call. I can walk you through that piece of cake. Seller concessions. Everybody's got a handle on this right now, right? All the co-brokes that you're working with across the table, everybody understands this 100%, no issues.
Yep.
I was being a little facetious there.
I have lots of questions. Go for it.
Lay it on me. Start with questions.
And I did refer to this. I was sitting here the other night and going through the differences between seller's concessions, seller's assistance, commission, when you can use it, when you can't use it. And I just think I need a whole refresher.
Great. So
Thank you.
let's start with the way it used to be. All the money came to the listing broker, and then the listing broker paid a cooperating broker for bringing a ready, willing, and able buyer to get that deal across the finish line. That buyer said, that buyer's agent said, I have a buyer. You have a property and a commission. I know there's a whole lot of work. Why don't we split the workload and we'll share in the commission? Everybody says, that's a great idea. Let's do it. I'll do the seller side stuff. You do the buyer side stuff, and I'll give you 2.5% of the commission. Okay, fair deal. Let's do it. And that's the way it was for, I don't know, about 100 years. Until we had some kind of shakeup. And they said, it would be better if we got some of this out in the open and put it on the agreement of sale. So we used to have a unilateral agreement of cooperation or a unilateral offer of cooperation that meant that if you were operating in the same MLS, you would publish the amount of cooperating compensation that was in the MLS. You remember that fondly. And if it was published and you guys operated in the same MLS, it was guaranteed, and you didn't really need a cooperating broker compensation letter, a CBC. We required it because we operate in a lot of different MLSs, and there's not always a guarantee or a unilateral offer of compensation. And we just want everyone to cooperate and get that figured out through communication when the contract's written, rather than fight about it at the settlement table. That's why we always requested that CBC on all of our transactions. Fast forward to August of last year, where they said, we would like to change things up and reiterate to sellers that they don't have to offer cooperating compensation. Enter item 3A, where it says, in addition to any cooperating compensation negotiated between the brokers using the cooperating broker compensation agreement. So in addition to whatever shows up on line 25 would be paid to the buyer's agent. So if there's no cooperating broker compensation, whatever you put on here is included. So if there's 1% on here, buyer's agent's getting paid 1% from the seller. and 0% from the seller's agent. If there was 2% on the CBC and 1% here, there's 2% from the seller's agent and 1% from the seller on the agreement. If there's 0 offered by Iron Valley to Coldwell Banker, that would be a 0 on the CBC. The seller says, kick rocks, I'm not paying anything. There would be 0 on the agreement of sale. How's that buyer's agent getting paid? Kristen Murray?
From the buyer.
From the buyer directly.
Yes.
So we have 3 different buckets that compensation may come from. Either the long way around the table, where it's handed from the seller to the listing agent to the buyer's agent. The medium route across the table, which goes directly from the seller to the buyer's agent, or the super short route, which goes directly from the buyer to the buyer's agent.
So I had an agent say that it's going to be 2% and don't bother filling out a CBC.
It's going to be 2% where?
2% buyer agent compensation.
Were they saying that that was going to be on the agreement of sale or being paid by the listing broker?
They didn't say.
Well,
They
we
didn't
need to
say.
get that specified, and I recommend and have recommended since the new laws came out that you should get, if they are offering cooperating broker compensation, shared compensation, listing broker compensation, whatever they call it, you should get that cooperating broker compensation form signed before you submit an offer.
Mm-hmm.
Because they could conveniently forget about it. And by that point, you have a signed agreement.
Yeah. And then say a lot of these folks are doing 2.5, 2, and then I'm having the buyer make up the 0.5%.
Right.
So, but that 0.5% doesn't go.
Hey, Justin.
Yes.
I'm just curious because I have been largely trying to avoid the CBC altogether. So I've just been putting it directly on the contract when we send it over. So I haven't seen any pushback from other agents.
That's fine. As long as it's in writing somewhere, it protects you and it protects your client. If they change it on the seller side and figure it out over there, great. As long as you're getting paid what you've been contracted to be paid, I'm happy. And as long as your buyer isn't somehow hoodwinked or surprised at the 1 yard line that they have to write an additional check to pay you for your services, I'm happy. I just don't want there to be surprises. So it's better to talk about these things up front. And if it's in the agreement of sale, it's not a problem.
So I have a question.
Yep. Oh,
So
and let me
Susan,
finish off one thing real
I'm
quick.
sorry.
If you put 3% in the agreement of sale, Kyle, and the listing broker says, hey, I'm paying you 3% on the CBC, so we're going to go ahead and strike that out. Great. That's fine. They're going to sign that CBC and send it over with 3%. And
Right. As long as I get the CBC beforehand. Yep.
yeah, and they're gonna change the agreement of sale to reflect 0. You still have 3% coming from the other side of the transaction so that your buyer isn't stuck holding the bag.
Right.
What-
Susan,
Sorry, go ahead.
Susan, you're
So
saying,
I
I'm
just
sorry.
have a question. So, Susan was saying about like if somebody pays, if the seller pays 2.5%, she charges the other 0.5% from her client.
Yep.
So I have not done that yet, but I don't know how many people do that. I'm just curious.
I do.
Okay.
There are more agents doing it today than have ever done it because we're setting that expectation up front because now we have to have a buyer agency agreement signed before we go out into the world with them. And the conversation that we have with them, and we'll have after we finish the agreement of sale, we're going to go right into the next session of buyer agency contract, which is Mrs. Hovetter expects me to bring home 3% to feed the kids, buy them shoes, send them to summer camp. My broker expects $495 to compensate our corporate partners, etc. I charge a
Yeah.
little extra. Um,
Yeah. I
and
mean, I
that's
had
okay.
that conversation, but like, I just haven't charged anybody yet.
You're a good, kind soul.
No,
And
I don't know about that. I think,
and I understand there's a little bit of fear there, a little bit of resistance. Try it. You might like it. And you know, whenever you're going into property, say, hey, they've agreed to pay, you know, the conversation on my side goes, Mrs. Hovetter expects 3%. You may be fortunate enough that a seller subsidizes some or even all of my broker fee. But if they don't, we may see some of that show up on your side of the spreadsheet. I did a sample closing sheet with 3% and 495 as a worst case scenario for you, so you know what you're walking into. We're going to do everything we can to try and get this worked into the transaction, but if it doesn't work that way, you know, we may have to work out some arrangement on the other side.
sorry to sidetrack you.
No, that's what this is all about, going back and forth and sharing stuff.
I should have had a chat with Mrs.
She's a
Hovetter at
taskmaster,
the
let me tell
Christmas
you.
party to let her know that her kids are going without shoes and food and stuff, okay?
Oh, she's aware.
Justin, I have a quick question.
Sure.
So I cannot wrap my brain around the difference between the Section A and the CBC. Like, to me, it's the same thing. I always get the CBC done, but like, when would a situation be where you would have to put the amount in Section A?
If I had a seller who was pretty savvy. He was an investor type. And I said, I think your condo is going to sell for 137.5 to 140 based on all of the other identical condominiums in your complex. And he said, I think mine's going to sell for 145. I said, great, I'm your guy. Now I work for 3%. We just need to figure out what we're going to pay pay a buyer's agent to incentivize that traffic. And he said, I don't want to pay them anything. I said, okay. Why not? He said, well, I need to clear this much money. He said, I don't want to be obligated to paying 3% if I get an offer at 125. Now, if I get an offer at 150, I'll pay the 3%. I said, okay, fair enough. So he offered 0, but we invited everyone to put their requested compensation on 3A. Okay, so there was no compensation offered, but he agreed to pay compensation if requested, depending on the offer.
Okay. In my mind,
Now.
I'm trying to figure out how the listing agreement reads then.
Okay, we'll go over that. I can go over that individually with you right away. If you like, I'll call you after this.
Okay.
Can I do a part B to her question?
Yep.
So okay, so the CBC and this, now you write this in, let's assume you don't know the CBC or you haven't been able to get a hold of the agent, so you write this in as a part of your offer, just like you would anything else as a negotiating tactic. I get that piece.
Yep.
Earlier, when you were having trainings earlier at the end of the year, etc., you were talking about a scenario where you don't want to duplicate somebody's compensation. What scenario was it, like where the seller's paying like 6% instead of 3%? If you put it here and you put it here, then you're going to have a problem. Can you remind me what that was all about?
Well, it could go a couple different ways. One is the seller might sign the listing broker might sign a CBC. So the
Yep.
listing broker signed a listing contract for 6%, same as they always have. They agreed to pay 3% to a buyer's agent, as they always have. And then Kyle comes along and puts 3% on here for broker's fee.
I get 6%.
Okay. So Kyle has a signed CBC for 3%, and somebody wasn't paying attention and signed an agreement with 3% on 3A going to Kyle. Now Kyle's getting 3% from the broker and 3% straight from the seller. Kyle's making out. Except for the wrinkle where Kyle's buyer agency agreement limits him to accepting 3%.
4.
4%. Because he's worth it. I mean, you set your price on what you want to work for.
Okay.
Okay.
Now that I'm absorbing all this, that makes sense. I just couldn't remember what scenario that might happen. I got it.
I have also had agents sign a listing contract. Tell you what, we'll sideline this a little bit because it's all about learning.
So just before you get into that part, basically the takeaway here for this section 3A, you got it here and or CBC. Either way, you got to have it documented in writing. So if you have it here and you don't necessarily have a CBC, you're still covered.
Correct. Correct.
Okay. Thank you.
But you can't have it both places. You either have one or the other.
I mean,
You can have
well,
it both places.
you can have 1.5 on both.
Right, because
Oh, come on.
well, in that case, if they are only offering 1.5 and you work for 3, then you put the additional. No.
Yep.
Yes.
Correct.
Do you have that right? Okay. So yeah, because in the beginning, in addition to any CBC, so the CBC could be 1%.
Yep.
And you want to get another one, so throw it in there for negotiating. Yes?
Yep.
Got it.
So the agreement of sale, we're going to write broker's fee is 6% here, right? So that means, Kristen Ziegler, you put 6% in here.
Yeah.
Down here on cooperating compensation, we're going to offer 3% to Kyle. So up here, it's 6 coming to the brokerage, 6 coming to Kristen.
Mm-hmm.
Kyle brings an offer, or Coldwell Banker brings an offer, or Howard Hanna brings an offer, and you're paying 3% to that brokerage for providing that ready, willing, and able buyer and sharing the workload to get this deal across the finish line. What I have seen happening is sellers press their agents and say, I heard I don't have to pay 6% anymore. Yeah, you're right. You don't. That's negotiable. It's always been negotiable. Can I, I work for 3. What would you like to offer? And they'll say 3%. But agents forget what they're doing and leave the 3 down here. So you're bringing in 3
Giving away 3.
and giving away 3. So
That's
what's
nice.
what's 3 minus 3?
Right.
Zip. Nothing.
What about your investor? How did you write that out with him not offering anything but maybe offering something?
Great. What we did there was 3
0.
and 0.
Mm-hmm.
And then what we did was invite agents to request compensation on the agreement of sale here.
Okay, so you didn't have anything additional spelled out on the listing agreement, like if the offer is above X, I will I will give compensation as X.
Right. So what happened was we had 14 showings the first week. We had 5 offers on the property. And this was before it became the law of the land in Pennsylvania. Um, we had 5 offers. And let me see how this went. No, 4 offers. 2 of them were at 150,000. 2 of them were at the asking price of 145. 3 of them were requesting 3% compensation. 1 of them was requesting 2.5 compensation. He accepted an offer for 150,000, which was 5,000 above the asking price, with 3% compensation because the terms were better.
Okay.
And everybody went home happy. He was happy because he got more than he was asking. No inspections or no, there was inspections, but it was a cash offer, and he was happy with that because I told him you got to be careful about appraisal.
Okay, I was just concerned about leaving it kind of up in the air and not having it written on the listing agreement.
That's the way I anticipate in the next 18 to 24 months, Pennsylvania is going to do away with cooperating brokerage altogether.
Okay.
And they're going to require the listing party to pay the listing agent and the buying party to pay the buyer's agent. I fully anticipate that. Delaware's gone that way. I think South Carolina, Virginia, California, a couple others.
Okay. Thank you.
So closing cost assistance is the same as it always was. We used to call it seller help, but that would be anything other than a brokerage fee. The reason that these things are separate is broker fee doesn't count to FHA, VA, USDA caps on what seller help is allowable or even on conventional. So you might have on a particular loan program 3 or 6% seller help be allowable and a buyer broker fee of 3%. So you might have 3% on the buyer broker fee, 6% on the closing cost assistance for a total of 9%. That's not going to violate the 6% seller help cap that goes along with VA or USDA loans. If you get your head turned into a pretzel on that while you're writing a contract or reviewing contracts, give me a call. We'll talk through it. Settlement date. Please don't put March. We need a specific date. That's what contracts are looking for. Something enforceable. Settlement will occur in the county where the property is located or in an adjacent county during normal business hours unless buyer and seller agree otherwise. Who else has to agree? The title company, they're pretty helpful. Also, the bank, we need to get a wire in. That's why it has to be during normal business hours so that, money can change hands. Have we done closings at Titan on a Saturday afternoon? Yep, absolutely have. But we made prior arrangements and got everything lined up. So if you see that kind of situation happening, raise your hand. We can probably work it out. At the time of settlement, the following will be prorated on a daily basis between the buyer and seller, reimbursing where applicable. Current taxes, the rents, interest on mortgage assumptions, condominium fees, HOA fees, water, sewer, any other lienable municipal services, and all charges will be prorated for the periods covered. The seller will pay up to and including the date of settlement, and the buyer will pay for all days following settlement into eternity unless some other arrangement's been made. Everybody pretty clear on that one? Everybody pays their fair share. For purposes of prorating real estate taxes, the periods covered are as follows. Municipal and school tax bills. If you're practicing in Philadelphia or Pittsburgh, that gets a little screwy. Conveyance from the seller will be by fee simple deed of special warranty unless otherwise stated here. If you are selling a recreational cabin or something like that, might be helpful to make a note there that there's no deed transfer. Payment of transfer taxes will be divided equally between the buyer and seller unless otherwise noted here. Typically, that's how much? I know you guys know this. It's 1% to either side. Possession is to be delivered by deed. Existing keys and physical possession to a vacant property free of debris with all structures broom clean at day and time of settlement unless seller, before signing this agreement, has identified in writing that the property is subject to lease. So, has anybody ever had an issue with that clause? Yeah, what happened, Kristen? Ziegler?
Well, there was a junk pile. I mean, it was on a big farm and there was a junk pile. It was like a burn pile. And to me, it's a burn pile. Well, in the day of settlement, the guy wanted all the junk taken off of it. And I just thought it was okay to leave it there.
What'd you do? Burn it?
Yeah, we had people come in and take the junk off.
Yep, I've been there. I've shown up to pre-settlement walkthrough. The sellers are still packing. I mean, I've seen plenty of messes there, and you just make the best of it. Try and work it out. Sometimes you hold some money back, sometimes you delay closing. You have to be careful though. If you go to settlement and your buyers sign the papers, whose junk is it now? It's the buyers. Once it's closed, they bought the house and the problems. So, we need to be very careful how we handle that. Now, if the seller has identified in writing that the property is subject to a lease or short-term rental, that gets a little bit trickier. If you find yourself in that situation, please give me a call. We're probably gonna say, do you have a tenant occupied property addendum? And, you know, how is that all gonna transpire? That's a little bit specialized and probably not something that everybody's dealt with or will deal with, but we'll talk more about that one. This is one of those red flag clauses. When it comes up, give me a call and we'll talk through it to make sure that everybody's protected. Leased properties can be a problem. Anybody ever bought a property that was a subject to a lease? Shevelin has. Moral of the story is it doesn't always go according to plan. Now, date and time is of the essence. Written acceptance of all parties will be on or before whatever date you have on there. The settlement date and all other dates and times identified for the performance of any obligation of this agreement and are of the essence and binding. So, of the essence is a legal time being of the essence. That's a legal concept. It means that the times and the dates are essential to the contract and essential to specific performance. So if somebody doesn't perform something by a date or time stated within this contract, that buyer may lose the right to negotiate on that basis, on whatever time frame they're talking about. And that negotiation may be for money or damages or repairs. And it may be significant. If we don't get a reply to inspection by, a certain time or date, then what happens? Buyer has to buy the property as is. Maybe this thing's falling into the ground and they are now obligated to buy a property that they don't want. Depending on the size of the earnest money deposit, it may be quite a hardship for them to walk away from that situation. And that's our job, is to make sure that we adhere to these timeframes. No excuse. So, is that 10 days after the inspection? No, that's 10 days after the contract's accepted. Is that 10 business days after the contract's accepted? Nope, that's 10 calendar days. Starting day one is the day after the contract's accepted. Day zero is the day it's signed. Now, let's look at 5A. Written acceptance of all parties will be on or before, let's pretend it's February 5th. No, let's pretend it's February 4th, and today's February 5th, and the seller gets this contract back to you fully executed on the 5th. You're the buyer's agent. Do we need to send this back to get that date updated? If you have it back and it agrees to everything that you want it to, you as the buyer's agent don't need to insist that that acceptance date of February 4th is updated to the 5th because the signatures happened on the 5th. You don't have to do that. What that does, that 4th, it gives your buyer the chance to not honor this offer if the sellers don't accept it by the 4th. And since they have accepted it as written on the 5th, we can move forward with this contract. It was voidable at your buyer's option. And since they have elected not to void it, they can move forward with this contract as written. Okay?
One starting on February 6th.
Yeah. Yeah. But if in doubt, get it fixed, whatever. Call me. I'll walk you through it. So this item C goes on to explain how the counting works and everything. The execution date of this agreement is the date when the buyer and seller have indicated full acceptance of this agreement by signing and or initialing. For the purpose of this agreement, the number of days will be counted from the execution date, excluding the day this agreement was executed and including the last day of the time period. All changes to this agreement should be initialed and dated. Roger that. Settlement date is not extended by any other provision of this agreement and may only be extended by mutual written agreement of the parties. If you don't have it in writing, you don't have it. We're in a situation right now with an agent in one of our offices whereby they meant to make the agreement of sale for the sale of her seller client's home contingent upon that seller finding suitable housing. That was not included in the agreement, but by verbal confirmation with the buyer's agent. The operative clause here is the seller or the settlement date is not extended by any other provision of this agreement and may only be extended by mutual written agreement of the parties. Just because the buyer's agent said, yeah, we'll give you more time if you need it, it's not exactly the case because we didn't have any other contingencies or didn't make any arrangement to extend this here. Certain terms and time periods are pre-printed in this agreement as a convenience to the buyer and seller. All pre-printed terms and times are negotiable and may be changed by striking out the pre-printed text. Zoning. Failure of this agreement to contain the zoning classification, except in cases where the property in each parcel if subdividable, is zoned solely or primarily to permit single-family dwellings. So if you're in a mixed use or commercial, most agricultural primarily does allow single-family homes, but this is voidable at the buyer's option. So as a listing agent, you should probably know what your zoning is. And if it's not for residential, you would want to make sure that it's included here. Maybe it's woodland conservation. Maybe it's mixed use. Maybe it's commercial. If you don't put it in there, that's a get out of jail free card until the closing table. Oh, fun with fixtures and personal property. Anybody here ever buy a washer, a dryer, a refrigerator? Sorry to admit I have. It was included in the fixtures as described in the MLS, but as the MLS will point out, it is deemed reliable but not guaranteed. It didn't make it to the contract. My bad. So I ended up buying a refrigerator, and that happens. So don't buy a refrigerator. Listen to me. Make sure that everything that's to be included is included here. What are some of the things that we don't think of on the routine?
Gazebos, security
Gazebos.
systems.
What was that
security
one?
systems. Mhm.
What was the system?
Security systems.
Security systems. I think security systems might be in here. Yep. Hardwired security systems are included.
Okay.
Thermostats, lighting fixtures. The one that I have seen happen, no, if owned, solar panels. Now, if they're leased, it better be included in here somewhere. The following items are not owned by the seller and may be subject to a lease or other financing agreement. Don't let someone slip leased solar panels in here if you're a buyer's agent and you not notice it and have somebody sign something, because then we're going to be fighting over your buyer having the obligation to pay $250 a month for the next 25 years for solar panels that they were kind of meh about anyway.
Playground equipment.
Playground equipment. The one that's come up to me is propane tanks. It does say any remaining heating and cooking fuels stored on the property at the time of settlement. It also says propane tanks and satellite dishes if owned, right? So what happens if the propane tank is leased? Does that mean that the propane stored on site goes with the property? Or is that propane prorated to the seller at the day of closing?
Doesn't the propane company figure that out?
They may. So you're saying it doesn't go with the property?
I
Sounds like
thought,
if the propane company's figuring it out, it sounds like it's prorated.
right. I
But
thought
it-
as long as the new buyer entered into a new agreement, then that fuel stayed, but they had to obviously had to prorate it.
What a lot of propane companies do, they will top off the tank and charge your buyers for a full tank and refund the seller the difference. So whatever was in there, they're going to be refunded for. Different propane companies work it different ways. So my advice to you, if you have a leased propane tank, specify it in here. Make sure it's in writing. That way, I mean, that could be $1,000 worth of propane. That could be a big deal. Just make sure that that is included in the conversation. So if you hear propane tank, next question, do you own the tank? Next question. Is there fuel in the tank and is it gonna go? We had that wind up in mediation. That's why I draw attention to it. Nothing's a problem if you talk about it in advance.
So a dumb
Okay.
question, if it is leased, because I just sold a mobile home and it was leased, but she left it there, the seller, because she owns the park and left the fuel there for the buyer. He just took over the lease.
Depends on
So,
the propane company, how they work that. Some propane companies are gonna say, well, if the tank's there and there's something in it, that's yours. Others are gonna come and fill it up, charge the buyer for a full tank, and then refund the seller for anything that was in there.
so then you're saying just put lease tank there then?
Uh, you're gonna wanna put lease tank on item C, and then you're gonna wanna make some sort of statement here, like propane and lease tank credited back to seller, or propane and lease tank, if any, credited to buyer. Depends which side of the equation you're on, how you want to work that. You know, seller might want to throw that in and say, there's a half a tank there. I already paid for it. You can have it as a value add because I'm not fixing the cracked window. You know, it might become a negotiation tool. But it's better to talk about it in advance than fight about it at the settlement table or afterwards. You're done. When you want it, whenever it's closed, you don't want any kind of negative feelings coming up and, haunting you on that. You want to be delivering positive vibes and working on referrals after the settlement table. You don't want to be doing damage control for free. All right. Buyer financing. This was updated here a couple of years ago, where it says the buyer may elect to make an agreement contingent upon obtaining mortgage financing, but regardless of any contingency elected in this agreement, if the buyer chooses to obtain mortgage financing, the following applies. So what's that mean? It means they may not have a mortgage financing contingency, but they still may get mortgage financing. If so, all this information down to mortgage contingency so items A, B, C, and D all still apply, even if there's no financing contingency. Capiche? So even if they don't have a mortgage contingency, the buyer will still be in default of this agreement if the buyer furnishes false information to anyone concerning their financial and or employment status. Or if they fail to cooperate in good faith with processing the mortgage loan application, or for ordering the appraisal without delay. So what's that mean? Ordering appraisal without delay. How many times have you called to say, hey, is that appraisal back yet, as a listing agent? And the buyer's agent or the lender says, oh no, we were waiting to get the results of the home inspection. Is that without delay? No, that's a delay. So you may be in violation of the agreement of sale for failing to order that appraisal without delay. Now, within 7 days from the execution date of this agreement, the buyer will make a completed mortgage application, including payment for and ordering of the credit reports without delay. For the mortgage terms and for the mortgage lender's identification or identified in paragraph 8F. Did you ever have a buyer who was shopping rates, decided to go with a mortgage company other than what was included in 8F? if you did, and they failed to get the mortgage, your client may be in default. Even if there is a mortgage contingency, if they didn't file their mortgage application with the one that was identified in the 8F, you can still be in violation of the agreement and lose your earnest money deposit. A lot of the things that we get tripped up on as buyer's agent exist within this paragraph 8 under buyer financing. So I urge you to pay attention to this one. And this will be the last thing that we cover today because I know your brains are full or you're bored or both. The broker has the right to reach out to the lender. The broker for the seller has the right to reach out and assist in this if there isn't a broker for the buyer. And they are authorized to communicate with the mortgage lender to assist in the mortgage loan process. And the broker for the seller, if any, is permitted to contact the mortgage lender at any time to determine the status of the mortgage loan application. So if you're the listing agent and you start to get weird feelings, your spider sense is tingling like things aren't moving at a reasonable rate, you have the right by this contract to reach out to that lender and seek information. The seller will provide access to the insurer's representatives and, as may be required by the mortgage lender, to surveyors, municipal officials, appraisers, and inspectors. And if the mortgage lender gives the buyer the right to lock in the interest rate, they have to lock that in 2 weeks prior to closing. Now, the loan to value ratio is used by lenders as a tool to help assess their potential risk of a mortgage loan. Do we all know how that works? The value is the sale price or the appraised value, whichever's lower. And the loan is the other part of that equation. This right here, this FHA VA, is an appraisal contingency, also called an amendatory clause. You will often have to sign a separate amendatory clause when dealing with FHA or VA deals to reiterate that the buyer has the right to walk if it doesn't appraise. And then this will specify whether or not you've issued them a HUD notice for your protection, get a home inspection. When do we need to use this form? When it's a government loan, FHA, VA, USDA, you should be checking that box and issuing your client for your protection, get a home inspection. And the buyer understands the importance of getting an independent home inspection. Is there any harm in using a HUD notice for your protection, get a home inspection on any transaction? Nope, no harm. Over disclosure, CYA, protect yourself, your client, your brokerage by getting that form. We also have another form that serves that purpose. And then this checkbox will describe if it's a 203K. What's a 203K? That is a renovation loan. Haven't seen too many of those lately. And we will also certify by signing this agreement that it is true to the best of our knowledge and belief. If you pull some kind of funky hanky-panky on this agreement of sale and everybody has signed it and it comes up to be fraudulent, then the federal government can prosecute you to the fullest extent of the law because they have included that there. Okay, next time we get together, we're going to pick up, because I have exceeded my allotted time, we're going to pick up on 8F, the mortgage contingency.
Hey, Justin,
Yo,
at one of our meetings, since you're anticipating, the demise of Co-broke, okay, can you share with us if you've heard any stories about the other states that are using it and how it has affected the buyer and the buying agent, to give us an idea as to what we can prepare for? You know what I mean?
yep, let me do some research. And
Thank you.
yeah, we feel that this settlement um, was halfway to what the Department of Justice was looking for, which was the uncoupling of seller and buyer compensation. The shoe hasn't fully dropped, although Pennsylvania, it doesn't necessarily have to do what the federal government does. And the federal government has signaled with suspension of Consumer Finance Protection Bureau that they may not care at all at this point. So um, it's kind of a wait and watch. This may affect what Pennsylvania does. It may not. We'll see. So,
Thank you.
all right. Appreciate you all. Stay tuned. At the very latest, we'll redo this or reconvene this next month. Stay tuned for emails. And if you have questions, hit me up. I'll talk to you later. Thanks.